Good evening, everyone. I'm Marie Dorigny. I'm the Paris director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination at Reed Hall. I'd like to give you all a warm welcome and a particular thanks to Marie-Hélène Contal, the director of the École Spéciale d'Architecture, right across the street, who was kind enough and very enthusiastic at the idea of co-sponsoring this event with us, which means that most of you are here tonight, which is really wonderful. And I'll briefly introduce this event and then I'll hand it over to Jana to give you a more in-depth presentation of this evening. Jana is a current fellow at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, and I'm very grateful to you for the honor of inviting Pier Vittorio Aureli to discuss his latest book, Architecture and Abstraction, and the themes and theses it brings out, notably considering abstraction in architecture not as an aesthetic tendency, but as a movement that mirrors modern divisions of labor and society. The author of over a dozen books, Pier Vittorio Aureli, is an architect and educator. He's taught at numerous universities in Europe and the United States, including our very own Columbia University, and is currently the director of the Institute of Architecture at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. They're too bilingual for me, sorry. Together with Martino Tatara, he is the co-founder of Dogma, an office for architecture based in Brussels with an interest in large-scale interventions, urban research, and domestic space. Jana Ndiaye Berankova is an art and architecture theorist, philosopher, writer, and publisher. She studied art history and comparative literature at the École Normale Supérieure and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales here in Paris, and architecture at Columbia University, where she completed her PhD dissertation on the links between architecture theory and French philosophy from 1965 to 1990. She runs a non-profit publishing house called Suture Press, beautifully designed hardback books on continental philosophy, contemporary art, and architectural theory. Her book of interviews with Alain Badiou, L'éclat de l'absolu, is not quite fresh off the press. It's actually in the press as we speak. And we'll be celebrating its publication right here on March 31st with Alain Badiou. So please join us, sign up for our mailing list so you stay informed of our events. And both books by Pier Vittorio and Jana are on sale from Suture Press and from the Red Wheelbarrow. And with that, I hand it over to Jana and Pier Vittorio. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Marie. Thank you so much, Sari and Meredith, for your hard work. I mean, this is really a dream opportunity, this fellowship, and I'm really so glad to be here and to be able to realize whatever crazy wishes we have and organize this event. The question I wanted to explain first is why this event? In May 2023 at Columbia, I underwent the usual sadistic ritual of academic life called a dissertation defense. After listening to my committee members contesting each other and wondering why did I dedicate 9 years of my life to bring back the long dead body of 1960s to end of 1980s architecture theory, and why indeed did I put this decaying corpse back on the dissecting table? And what more, why did I look into what role the abstruse concepts of French philosophy, theory, and linguistics articulated by thinkers as diverse as Louis Althusser, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Julia Kristeva, Roland Barthes, and Jacques Derrida played in this body of writing? I walked out to the room of my alma mater, as they say, in a state of an utter exhaustion. Realizing that I wrote probably a good dissertation but not yet a book, and asking myself what next, I strolled down the aisles of the neighborhood bookstore in Morningside Heights. Those of you who know the neighborhood, it's book culture, so I promote the bookstore, where the title Architecture and Abstraction of this book laying here actually attracted my attention. Although I have read some books of Aureli a long time ago, when I encountered this most recent work, I had the feeling that this book had the potential to help me to understand the tasks and trajectories that lay ahead of me. Therefore, when Marie told me about the possibility that we fellows at this wonderful institute have to organize our events, I suggested that I would like to invite and meet the author of this book, and I'm so glad that he accepted my invitation. I would say that Architecture and Abstraction is perhaps Aureli's most major book so far. To a certain extent, I could say that this book is a sort of an oxymoron, for it connects two seemingly disjoint elements: Marxism and the very classical Western canon of architecture theory. The connecting element in Aureli's book is the notion of abstraction. Abstraction, which he does not see merely as an aesthetic category, as in abstract art, you know, the paintings by Piet Mondrian and so on, but he also relates it to Marx's notions such as exchange value and the problems of division of labor under capitalism. Using these concepts allows Aureli to show that any aesthetics is inherently political. By making visible architectures and cities' complicity in capitalism, he allows us, at least for a very brief moment, to dream about different forms of social organization without the usual ideological confusions and mystifications. Aureli's treatment of the notion of abstraction is grounded in his interpretation of Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space, a book from 1974, namely of his distinction between the so-called concrete and abstract space, and also in the less known book titled Intellectual and Manual Labor, a critique of epistemology, written by a German Marxist thinker affiliated with the Frankfurt School, Alfred von Rethel. To understand better this argument and to torture you with some of the philosophic concepts, let's have a look at how von Rethel defines abstraction in Intellectual and Manual Labor. In the chapter 3 titled The Commodity Abstraction, Alfred von Rethel explains it as follows. He tells us, in line with Marx, that the form of commodity is abstract and abstractness governs its whole orbit. Therefore, the category of the exchange value, you know, there's this equivalence of commodities on the market, which indeed has nothing to do with their use value. He also talks about labor, the extent to which labor, actually, when we determine the magnitude and substance of value, any labor becomes an abstract human labor under capitalism. He speaks of the paradox that, in fact, the form in which the commodity value takes on its concrete appearance as money, whether it's coinage or bank coins, it takes this material form, but it's already an abstract thing, and which, strictly speaking, for him, as he mentions, in line again with Marx, is a contradiction in terms. And we know that today, the capitalism today actually is moving towards an ever-increasing process of abstraction, you know, whether it's bitcoins, we get rid of the gold standard and whatever. So it's really, there's really a movement towards an increasing abstraction. He also talks about a man as an abstract man, abstract individual, the citizen as a property owner under capitalism. And he reminds us that, society that's governed by commodity exchange is already governed by an abstract set of relations. I think what's important to know here is the idea that for von Rethel, abstraction, it's not just a matter of thought. It actually originates in man's actions. So there's not some ideal and concrete sphere of reality, but the abstract is already in the concrete. Therefore, in Marx's thought, he reminds us real abstraction results from spatial temporal activity. It's not some ideal speculation as in Kant's philosophy and so on. And I think that this is where actually it becomes interesting for architects. For we know that architecture is simultaneously about forms of thought and forms of matter. I like to quote a description of my friend and professor Alain Badiou, who in one of the interviews that we did spoke of Plato's theory of participation and defined Plato's realm of intelligible ideas as, I quote, In French, ce qui dans la matière va vers l'idée, or to translate it, what in the matter leads towards the idea. In this way, he rejected the usual dualism in which the ideal world, which is on one side, and the material on the other. Architecture, I would say, is from its very origins what in the matter leads towards the idea. This we find already in Vitruvius' De Architectura, in which he distinguishes between the so-called fabrica, namely the practice of building and construction, and ratiocinatio, namely reasoning or the ideation of building before its realization. And I would say that this hybridity is what makes architecture so fascinating. The problem of our present times, and perhaps of this thing, and perhaps of architecture and urban planning in general, might be that we have lost the idea. At least that is what certain mostly Anglo-Saxon authors proclaimed following the 2000 MoMA conference titled Things in the Making, Contemporary Architecture and Pragmatist Imagination, when they somehow ambitiously affirmed that theory is dead and that after the post-historical we also enter the post-theoretical or post-critical age. While what they understood as theory, namely the abstruse pseudo-conceptual mixes such as deconstructivism, in which Derrida's deconstruction was put into sort of one melting pot with Soviet constructivism, and it really doesn't make much sense. So why these abstruse mixes probably merited to die of their own contradictions, the fact is that the architectural field today seems to be very much stuck in fabrica, in commodified forms of design subjected to omnipresent dictatorship of the media spectacle. What I like about Aureli's book is that it shows us that another theoretical thinking on architecture is possible. Architecture theory doesn't have to be just about linguistic games and loosely interpreted post-structuralist concepts, as it was in the 1970s and 1980s in the US, but also about rethinking anew the premises of the field. I would say that in architectural scholarship, and perhaps in all scholarship more generally, there are two possible research methodologies, and obviously the best authors combine both of them, but this combination is really rare. The first one consists in writing about new and unmapped territories, in analyzing the works of architects that received very little scholarly attention. For instance, like the kind of work on Dakar urban planning and the Bureau d'études Henri Chomet that I'll be presenting in about 2 weeks from now at my fellows rendezvous. There is very little existing literature on Chomet's work in Senegal. Even the archival sources are actually quite hard to come by, and therefore such scholarly methodology is by definition expansive, oriented outwards, covering new fields of reality. The second methodology, which I think is here epitomized in Aureli's book, and perhaps also it was in my own PhD thesis, is intensive rather than expansive. It's oriented inwards. The goal is not as much to expand knowledge by bringing into play new authors and new archival sources, but to deepen it, to rethink the premises of the field anew. In my view, that is precisely what Aureli achieves in his new book. Some might object that the theorists, architects and theorists such as Léon Battista Alberti, Jean-Nicolas Louis-Durand, or Hannes Meyer, that he comments upon are too well known, too canonical, too wide. However, the main contribution of this book is the new and original conceptual angle with which he approaches well-known texts and drawings that we can find in the syllabi of many introductory basic Western architecture courses. The word paradigm came to Latin via Greek from paradeiknunai, meaning showing side by side. Aureli's books are composed of a series of paradigms in which classical architecture tradition appears side by side with Marxism. To give you one example, let me mention the way in which he treats Filippo Brunelleschi. Different art historians and theorists, such as Hubert Damisch or Carlo Giulio Argan, wrote quite beautiful pieces on Brunelleschi, who, as you certainly know, invented linear perspective and built the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. In the 1968 Theories and History of Architecture, Manfredo Tafuri interprets Brunelleschi as the first avant-gardist because he, I quote, institutionalized a linguistic code and a symbolic system based on a super-historical comparison with the great example of antiquity, end of quote. Here, Tafuri claims, I quote, that the anti-historicism of modern avant-garde as art is not, therefore, the result of an arbitrary choice, but rather the logical end of a change that has its epicenter in the Brunelleschian revolution and its basis in the debate carried on for more than 5 centuries by European culture. In other words, Brunelleschi is a figure that we encounter at the origin of architecture representation and which somehow, to a certain extent, opens the possibility of architecture theory. This aspect of the somehow controversial architect that Aureli stresses in his books are linked to the problems of division of labor. In fact, Brunelleschi is a figure that epitomizes the split between the building contractors and the architects. Under medieval ages, architecture knowledge has been transmitted mostly orally. The head masons performed the role of the architects, and their independent workshops were protected under the guild system. When Brunelleschi invented new forms of architecture representation, it allowed him to take control over the building site, to affirm that an architect is a separate social role, different from those of, let's say, masons or master craftsmen. Masons could hardly read his drawings or understand the mysterious geometries that made the Florence dome hold. In a preface to the 2013 collective volume, City as a Project, Aureli writes the following, I quote, Brunelleschi's invention of perspective allowed him to abstract the building logic in the form of a 3-dimensional grid. For this reason, Brunelleschi imagined the building not as a space enclosed by walls, but as a skeleton made of clearly defined structural lines. This approach was not only motivated by the desire to undermine the form of the building within a coherent design, but also by the will to control the building process by reducing the role of the builders to the execution of a predefined scheme. For this reason, Brunelleschi can be considered the first modern architect. He clearly understood the power of the project as something independent from the process of building. In other words, Brunelleschi turned the architecture process into an apparatus of social control. In Architecture and Abstraction, Aureli goes even farther by treating Brunelleschi as a figure that emerged from a political counter-revolution during which a guild power was countered by an emerging capitalist elite that saw architecture as a fundamental political investment. Brunelleschi could emancipate himself from the guild structure only thanks to the support of a wealthy Florentine oligarchy who feared workers' uprising. In fact, in 1378, textile workers led a major revolution, a so-called Tumulto dei Ciompi, and established a short-lived revolutionary government in Florence. Sorry, I would hope so. Brunelleschi was arrested for not paying guild duties, but the authorities were forced to release him because the works on the dome of the Florence Cathedral could not continue without his supervision. A single misplaced brick would compromise the fragile geometry of the structure. Indeed, when workers at the construction site of the cathedral organized a strike because the architect forced them to endure unbearably long working hours, Brunelleschi simply broke the strike by hiring a cheaper labor force from another region, thus forcing the rebellious workers to return to work at a lower wage. Therefore, Brunelleschi played a crucial role in helping to subordinate the manual labor to the intellectual labor under the Renaissance. Later, with Alberti, the architect came to be seen as the sole author of a building, despite the fact that any building is a collaborative enterprise that involves many actors, builders, and experts from different fields. To conclude, and also to place architecture and abstraction in a broader context, I just want to briefly remind an older 2008 book of Aureli, namely The Project of Autonomy, Politics and Architecture Without and Against Capitalism, which was published in 2008, in fact, during the economic crisis, in collaboration with the Biel Center. Again, this is close to home. In this brief book, Aureli contests the general interpretation of the notion of autonomy, or of the so-called autonomous architecture, by showing the extent to which the work of Manfredo Tafuri, Aldo Rossi, and the groups such as Archisum was rooted in the work of Italian Marxist theoreticians Raniero Panzieri and Mario Tronti and the Operaist movement. In this manner, he contests a common understanding of autonomous architecture in Anglo-Saxon architecture culture that equated the autonomy with the autonomy of architectural form from political, social, and commercial signification, and that group often totally different personalities, such as Aldo Rossi and Manfredo Tafuri in Italy, or Peter Eisenman and Colin Rowe in the United States, just, I quote, by virtue of their common critical point of view toward the exhaustion of the reformist apparatus of the modern movement. In contrast, Aureli strives to show that, at least in the 1960s, the notion of autonomy was in itself inherently political. For instance, he reminds us that, I quote, for Aldo Rossi, autonomy signified first and foremost a possibility of new urban theory, of rejecting technocratic determinism, and proposing instead an almost humanistic reading of political, social, and cultural signification of urban phenomena. And indeed, when we speak about Rossi, I think this quote of Aureli, I would really limit it just to 1960s, because already in 1981, when Rossi publishes the so-called scientific autobiography, which was published first in English, we already see that he has abandoned this ambition. And indeed, if we decipher his manuscript in the blue notebooks, we actually see how melancholic and sad he was in his late career, despite all his success and as a practicing architect. Basically, just the notebooks are full of these complaints about how he cannot read and what he cannot do, because just like his career as an architect kind of, is just growing too fast. Further, Aureli writes the following, I quote, autonomy was not the creation of politics and poetics ex nihilo, but rather an audacious effort to appropriate the political realm in order to construct an alternative to capitalist domination. I would say that the Aryan threads uniting all of Aureli's books is a desire to overcome the crises brought forward by postmodernity, which indeed forced the intellectuals to refuse any totalizing vision of history understood as a process of human liberation. As an anti-historical coup d'etat, postmodernity deprived them of any possibility to promote emancipation, social change, and to imagine a world beyond capitalism. It brought us perhaps to the present state of social and political crisis, in which, I would say, looking at the Trump administration, we could indeed inverse Marx's quote from the 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte and say that first it happened as a farce, then as a tragedy. And obviously myself, as someone who grew up in the sort of post-communist sphere of Prague, I was in my childhood, and the space over there was very much, I would say, the intellectual debate was really marked by this kind of a Fukuyama's, ideas of the post-history and amnesia and forgetting, the previous regime. I definitely feel very personally, how I would say, like sensitive towards those questions. I would say that by writing rigorously theoretical books, Aureli helps us to think critically about the role of architecture in the present world, while simultaneously avoiding the trap of architecture engagée, namely architecture in which the architect is a social activist who doesn't have sufficient distance from practice and therefore cannot understand his or her own structural role within the system and cannot formulate a truly radical critique of architecture under capitalism. In my opinion, his books help proving that architecture theory in itself is not inherently apolitical. Its politics emerges in a continuous dialectical movement of proximity and distance to the real. In my view, a certain distance, or if we use this vocabulary, we could say autonomy, is necessary prerequisite if architecture theory is ever to serve the critique of capitalist instrumentalization of architecture and urban planning, and to be able to formulate alternative affirmative possibilities for the present. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Jana, for this very good introduction. I mean, I'm almost overwhelmed by looking my work through your lens. So I apologize if my presentation will be felt a bit undertone, but I just taught a 4 hours lecture this morning to my students. I have a class of 180 students, and every week I give a lecture to them, and after 4 hours you feel like a bit drained, but I hope I will have still some energy to talk about my book. So I assume that many of you, or most, or maybe all of you, have not read the book, so I will just give you a very oversimplify synopsis. As Jana said very eloquently, and I don't have much to add, the hypothesis of the book is basically trying to look to abstraction not as an aesthetic category, which is maybe the most familiar interpretation of abstraction within architecture, since actually also there has been a lot of exchange between, as you will see in a moment, between art and architecture when it comes to abstraction. But to look at abstraction really as a social synthesis, as a process through which our human civilization has evolved in the, not only actually in the last centuries, but also in the last millennia, especially when we started to form large-scale societies, which is, of course, a very specific historical process. But of course, then abstraction, as Jana mentioned before, really escalates with the rise of capitalism as the mastery of our civilization, and of course becomes really a central focus, a central governing deus ex machina through which actually our society reproduces itself. So the ambition of this book was really to describe architecture in light of this interpretation of abstraction. But the paradox is that, in fact, I became interested in abstraction because I've always been interested in abstract art. So in a way, what I claim in my argument is immediately contradicted by the fact that my point of entry actually to abstraction has not been philosophy, but really art, and especially painting. And here you see two painters that I really like a lot, Piet Mondrian, who actually happened to live for a very long time here in Paris, and Peter Halley. And actually what I recognize is that many painters or artists that were involved in abstraction, they also wrote a lot, which is interesting. So written text or language was a very important medium for them to express themselves. And often they associate abstract art to the experience of the metropolis. This is very clear in Mondrian writings. I mean, if you read the Mondrian writings, which are also very beautiful, very enigmatic, very elusive, but also extremely suggestive, Mondrian really mentioned several times how basically his idea of abstraction really was also a reaction to his experience of the metropolis, especially the Paris of the 1920s and 30s. The streets, the movement, the flows, the advertisement, these colors that Mondrian used were colors that he really saw in the pages of magazines, but also in the streets of the city. So, and the same actually with Peter Halley. I mean, Peter Halley has written, in my opinion, the best text on abstraction, and he actually argued how his art is not an idealization, a process of idealization, but really a reflection how we constantly dwell into abstraction, from even our daily experience. We constantly move, as he showing this beautiful painting, through cells and conduits. How our life is constantly managed by forces where the, in fact, hybridity between material and immaterial is constantly at stake. So that was my point of entry, also because I have a parallel life as a painter myself, and I've always been interested in abstraction, especially in landscape, and landscape has been a fundamental source of abstraction in a way, and it's interesting how many painters really looked at landscape, the experience of landscape. Again, Mondrian is a very important figure in that respect, as no longer an image of nature, but really an image of a completely man-made condition in which, again, the abstract order of land subdivision, for example, play a very important role. And in fact, this relationship between abstraction as a process and abstraction as an image has been, and of course, abstraction as a form has been always a focus of my interest. In fact, an image that I wanted to use in my book was this beautiful photograph by Andreas, beautiful and terrifying photograph by Andreas Garsky. I couldn't use it because the rights were too expensive, so I was running out of money. So I'm happy to, I hope I don't have to pay the rights if I show it in the video. But in fact, as Jana said, this interpretation of abstraction that first came from the arts was soon, in fact, confronted by reading of certain books where abstraction acquired slightly also different interpretation. And Jana already mentioned these books that were really in the back of my mind when I wrote Architecture and Abstraction. The first, of course, is the Grundrisse, especially the introduction, because I think that Marx, in the introduction of the Grundrisse, gives one of the most profound and also accessible, let's say, interpretations of abstraction, where he really re-theorized the way in which abstraction, in fact, becomes concrete, and how the concrete of abstraction also affect the very existential way of life of the modern subjectivity. It really refers, for example, to the United States of the 19th century as a place where abstraction, especially the abstraction of the factory, but also the abstraction of human exchange, was really becoming a dominant condition. Of course, the idea of abstract space that so eloquently Lefebvre introduced in his book, The Production of Space, in opposition also to ancient form of spatial organization, like the idea of absolute space. And more importantly, the book that Jana was mentioning before, Intellectual and Manual Labor, by Alfred Sohn Rethel, which was really a primary source for many ideas that, in fact, drive my book. However, there were also two other books that I have to say had a huge influence, especially in the way of writing the book itself. One is Techniques and Civilization by Lewis Mumford. It's a book that I have to say maybe is my favorite book in all the books that I've read, especially in terms of history. I think it's an incredible historical interpretation of human civilization through the lens of technique and the evolution of technique. And the other book is a book by Maria Mies, a feminist writer, Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, especially because both books have this, they're both theoretical books, but are very rooted into history. And for me, this is very important, that theory cannot exist without historical understanding of the context in which we live. And this sounds actually maybe obvious for some of you, but today actually I feel that a lot of architectural theory is ahistorical. So it's a theory that is often placed outside history. It's usually let's say, the architect or the theorist imagination of something, remove actually from the historical context. And what I really like about these books, that both books are not written by historians, they are not written by, let's say, scholars, but by people who were also politically very involved in their struggles which they were part, but they took this historical perspective. And for me, this is very important. I mean, actually, my book, although I'm not an historian, I'm not really a scholar in a way, I'm an architect, the book actually has a very strong historical perspective. And for me, this is actually very important. I mean, I hope that if you happen to read the book, that will be quite explicit. So, what is actually the purpose of looking to the relationship between architecture and abstraction? The purpose for me is a sort of history, but also what I would call metacritique of the architectural project. So I wanted to really go deeper into what is an architectural project, what implies that we first design a building before build it. I mean, something that for now is very obvious, but if we look to this process from an historical point of view, we realize that this is not an obvious condition. This separation between project and building is really an historical process. A process actually without, not without conflicts. And some of these conflicts were mentioned before by Jana, but actually the whole history of the architectural project is profoundly shaped by conflicts. Conflicts that, of course, not only come from the division of labor, the division between manual and intellectual labor, but also by the social relationships that an architectural project inevitably imply. So my book, I mean, I will go now through very quickly through its chapters, and I have to say the images are more important than my words, but in the very first chapter, I really try to define what is an architectural project. And I try to locate its origin, although, of course, origins is a tricky word that I use with a lot of caution, in the building of large-scale monumental structures, in what later on we would call temples, because temples were a concentration of political, economic power. As you know, in antiquity, temples were also storages of wealth. So in a way, they were literally concentration of both economic, political, and religious power. And of course, often they were built according to a plan, according to a very specific design that often was hierarchically organized, in the sense that this design was usually imposed on a mass of people that were de facto organized in such a way that they would execute the plan that was put, let's say, beforehand. And also the refinement of this process of construction through design has a lot to do also with the importance of budgets, the importance of economy, especially money economy. This really happened in the ancient Greek period, especially in a moment where, and this is something that historians have often overlooked, the fact that the transformation of large-scale buildings from timber to stone more or less happened when, in many Greek polis, money economy started to become very pressing, very important, and of course, money economy really produce a much more precise way of looking at things, of evaluating them, measuring them, and in fact, Richard Seaford, a very important historian, argued that, for example, philosophy or even ways of thinking the world in more abstract terms are really a consequence of the pervasive use of money in this society. But of course, in modern times, a very important moment in which the separation of design and construction really start to emerge is really with the building of the most important large-scale constructions for at least 3 centuries, which were cathedrals. Of course, Saint-Denis, as you know, is not a cathedral, but it was the prototype for the building of many cathedrals in the 12th and then 13th and 14th century. And it's here actually that the role of the architect start to emerge as the one of who really has this role of coordination, of organization, in which the project is really a tool, as Jana actually very well said, a tool of not just designing form, but also of controlling the labor force in the building site, and also of, in a way, dispossessing builders of their agency, because, of course, things like the classical orders, proportions, the very act of design becomes inaccessible, basically, to them. And of course, this is not just something that comes from the will of the architect. This is really a social transformation in which these more democratized forms of production, like the one that was driven by the guilds, was actually under attack by the emerging elites that would lead the capitalist transformation of many European cities at that time. And of course, here really we enter the very core of abstraction in architecture, which is really the rise of disegno, which very soon becomes design as the omnipresent, let's say, condition in which we produce architecture. Of course, I look especially to how this process is already driven by the way in which architects start to see architecture through the abstraction of orthogonal projection. For example, a language that was very inaccessible to builders, whose know-how was really based on the empirical experience of materials and the building site. So in a way, this way of representing architecture was really something that became a specialized way to understand form and space. But a very crucial moment in which, in fact, disegno becomes design is in what I believe in the history of architecture is one of the most overlooked, let's say, fields of building activity, which was very important between the 16th and the 18th century, which is actually fortification design. Of course, there is a lot of literature about the design of fortifications, and especially at the moment where artillery start to become actually a paramount form of warfare. So this really completely changed the way in which defense was organized, and a completely change of the way in which fortifications were built, because the advent of artillery really pushed a much more precise and more abstract form of waging war, which required also a much more precise defense, but also fortifications that could be built very fast, with very complex geometric configurations, which could only be designed by specialists. Even architects sometimes have difficulty to reach the complexity, geometric, mathematical complexity that this kind of design would require. In fact, one could argue that in a way the architect is really the architect in this process really becomes engineer, and even more specialized towards construction rather than proportions and ornament, which was his mastery actually in the previous period. And of course, with fortification, there is an increasing optimization of the building site that really require a completely new way of designing, where in fact architecture really becomes mostly a form of managerial control rather than a form of producing specific forms. And of course, this is this know-how that becomes actually very important in military design, soon really start to percolate the way in which cities themselves are conceived and designed, where in fact infrastructure, circulation, all the invisible layers of the city becomes actually more important than the actual visual spectacle of architecture and cities, something that is very well portrayed in this very iconic plate by Pierre Pat. But the response of architecture, of course, is it's increasing standardization, it's increasing production through typological design, which does not conceive architecture anymore as a production of one-off specific buildings, but really as classes of buildings. And of course, this becomes very evident in the 19th century, just at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, where in fact the architecture of the factory will play a leading role. So at this point in the book, there is an intermezzo, there is a kind of little pause, if you want, and I zoom out, so I don't look to architecture and the building especially. For a moment, I look actually to the urban condition, and there is a chapter on the urban grid, and which is, in my opinion, perhaps the most explicit manifestation of the way in which abstractions rule the world. In fact, I would say the grid is not just a form of rationalizing topography, it's also a way to measure, a way to subdivide land according to very specific political and economic conditions. Of course, we know that the grid emerged in antiquity, so it's not something that appeared in modern times. And already since then, the grid really has this sort of accounting purpose. You know? The grid is really a system through which populations, settlers are often organized. And what is interesting that since antiquity, the grid appear always in proximity to act of colonial occupation. I mean, since ancient Egypt, but also in Greek and Roman times, the grid is a device through which very strong and well-organized states would immediately settle populations that have this very colonial relationship with their own context. And this is something that, of course, we have become accustomed in modernity, but it's something that is already evident in ancient civilizations. And of course, very soon the grid is no longer an architectural device, it's really a sort of cadastral, if you want, tool through which land is commodified, is given an economic value. And of course, this is really at stake in many development of cities, especially between the 17th and the 20th century, when basically most of urban projects are driven by the logic of the grid, to a point that even entire nations, like United States, are basically designed politically, geographically through the grid, which at this point is not just is not actually for the sake of distributing infrastructure, but is to really figure forth the property, the command of property over land, which is really the fundamental purpose of imposing a grid. Usually, I don't talk really about grid. I don't like so much the use of this word, because when you mention grid, especially within architecture, people immediately think of a Cartesian or a perfectly regular grid, which is, for me, I mean, it's one kind of grid. I prefer to use, and in fact, in this chapter, I use often the word subdivision or land subdivision, which can actually also have, could be also more irregular, than, let's say, regular grids or square grids, but nevertheless has the same logic of defining property relations, which are the quintessential nomos, let's say, of the modern and contemporary city. So in chapter 4, I go back to the building itself, and I look to the commodification of building form by looking to two fundamental archetypes of Western, let's say, urban form or architectural form, the townhouse and the factory. And of course, this is perhaps the most explicit manifestation of abstraction in architecture, especially through the invention of the typical plan, that could be adjusted to whatever kind of production or form of production was meant to be organized within this, let's say, form, which is reduced to its bare 0-degree structure. But this process of reduction was really tuned to the content that was meant to take place in these buildings. And towards the end, the last 2 chapters are a kind of medley, if you want, of the work of architects that I have been studying for many years, how they actually reacted to this condition of abstraction. In the 5th chapter, I look to the work of early Soviet avant-gardes, especially architectural avant-gardes, looking to a paradox that for me has always been very intriguing, in the sense that, interestingly enough, the early Soviet artists and architects were the first to really implement abstraction, let's say, into architecture and art via formalism. So formalism was a fundamental way of looking to the world by not only actually architects and painters, but also literary critics, and of course, in fact, the term formal analysis or formalism really come from that tradition. And of course, formalism was really an attempt to remove art and form from any possible signification, really as a sort of datum in itself. But this really happened at the moment these artists and architects try to implement this understanding of art and architecture at the service of the Bolshevik revolution. And of course, this sort of paradoxical situation generated a lot of interesting contradictions that I describe actually in the book, especially looking to the work of 2 architects I, of course, deeply admire, Mose Ginsburg and Ivan Leonidov, where this tension between formalism and social and political reform is very intense, especially both in their projects, but also in their writings. And you know what happened to them after actually they tried to bridge these 2 incompatible, let's say, projects. And finally, the last chapter is a homage to another author that through my career has a long, very strong impact. I mean, someone who you know, of course, very well, Walter Benjamin. Is an author that I read many times, actually, one of the few authors that I read many times. I've not read many books, but usually I read many times the same books or the same essays. And one of these essays that for me is almost like, how to say, like a guiding light is Experience and Poverty, an essay that he wrote, if I'm not wrong, in the early 30s. It's a beautiful essay where actually, it's one of the few essays where Benjamin really mentioned modern architecture, Le Corbusier and Adolf Loos specifically, although his interpretation of modern architecture was often not really, let's say, precise, but very evocative. And of course, in this essay, Benjamin described how the experience of the metropolis, the experience of modernity, coincide with an increasing lack of experience, with a poverty of experience. And poverty of experience for Benjamin was not the scarcity of things, but on the contrary, the condition that arose the moment we are overwhelmed by all kinds of stimulus, all kinds of, let's say, experiences especially in the modern metropolis. And instead of actually of course, Benjamin really highlights the dangers of this condition. It's not actually like many avant-gardes of the time, like the futurists celebrating this condition. He understands actually the collateral effects of this process of abstraction, if you want, of the modern habitat, human habitat, but instead of rejecting it, he argued that perhaps by radicalizing it, by making it explicit, one can come to terms with it. So I use actually this Benjaminian interpretation of our poverty of experience in order to look to a series of architects from Le Corbusier to Hilberseimer, Hannes Meyer, Margaret Schutt-Eliotsky, Arki Zoom, and finally the anonymous architecture of data centers as a sort of moments in which this poverty of experience really affect architecture, the production of space, but in very radical and explicit terms. And the book, of course, is not promoting, let's say, this kind of architecture. I mean, the book doesn't prescribe any solution or any, let's say, specific position towards abstraction. In a Benjaminian manner, I was more interested to highlight those moments of clarity that perhaps could help us to demystify the way in which the architectural project has historically evolved until now. That's it. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Pier Vittorio. I think, there will be a lot I could react on in your talk. Just by the way, as a side note, in about 2 weeks, I'll be talking about the urban planning of Dakar, which is also based on a grid. The first plan is a grid plan. So there'll be way more talks about grids. But I wanted to ask a perhaps more kind of a personal question first. Namely, that division between theory and practice. Obviously, I speak here as, I'm someone who kind of survives in the field of architecture, but I'm really a theorist and a writer. Perhaps the only practice that I do is the publishing of books. I would say that books are my practice. I would like to ask you, how would you define the role of theory of architecture in the present moment? And also, you said that you spoke about all those activities that you do with Dogma. Like, how is the relationship between theory and practice articulated in your own work? To give one example, I was looking at your website, for instance, the project that was titled Loveless really intrigued me, perhaps for the personal reason that it's inspired by Karel Teige's 1932 criticism of the notion of minimum dwelling, which is really interesting for me because I actually spent last year working in Teige's archives, like doing research in Teige's archives in Prague, which contain amazing correspondence, like often in Czech, unfortunately for most of you, with, I don't know, like Breton and Éluard, and there's a really beautiful things there, and it's archives which, by the way, were organized in '68, so it's a really good archive. And obviously nowadays, architects who write are extremely rare. So I just wonder, how would you articulate the role of what you do or what you try to do in this kind of a triad, or maybe 4 terms, namely theory, criticism, practice, and perhaps history?
Actually, my books, my writings that you can call my theoretical work, is very much rooted in my teaching. So teaching is a very important activity in my life, is also how I survive. At a certain point I felt, although actually I started teaching, and I mean for many years I taught studio, I taught design, which was very important experience, and of course which went parallel also to my practice. At a certain point, many years ago, I decided to also teach history and theory, basically. And in fact, 2 years ago, I decided to stop teaching studios and only teach history and theory, because I felt that also in my studio, I would spend a lot of time explaining students not so much what they were supposed to do, but why. Why architecture, why design, why a project, why to produce social housing or a museum. And somehow I felt that if you are too much close to design, to this urgency of design, the urgency of doing a project, somehow you don't have time to really elaborate on these questions, which for me are very important. At the same time, I didn't want to go too far from the project, from architecture. That's why for me, to have a foot into practice or into dogma is very important, because I still feel myself as an architect. I would never claim myself as an historian, although now I engage a lot with historical research, but I feel a very strong affiliation. I mean, I don't know how people perceive my work, but for me, this affiliation to the project, to architecture, to making projects, to making plans, to make design is actually very important. But at the same time, I don't allow this affiliation to overrule my teaching, my theory, because when you teach, you have a certain responsibility to not somehow be too dependent on your own interpretation or your own way of designing or producing architecture. So teaching is really this didactic moment in which many themes and problems that I then elaborate in my books really are born in a way. So pedagogy is perhaps the main compass of my work.
Well, that reminds me what I was saying about the fact that, any theoretical thinking on architecture actually emerges in a certain proximity and distance, but we still need to keep some sort of a distance from practice, otherwise we're unable to think. And I was wondering, obviously, in architecture scholarship there's this very obvious famous notion of Manfredo Tafuri's and namely his critique of operative criticism. Do you think that what Tafuri tried to articulate with operative criticism, when obviously he was opposing figures like Brunelleschi, is just very dated, or it's just a historical role, or can we still learn something from his, let's say, critique of operative critique? Is there something relevant in his criticism for today?
Absolutely. Actually, I just finished now. It was a very long project to edit an anthology of Tafuri's writings. Which was a very painful process, as you can imagine, especially translating Tafuri into English, because the anthology was really an opportunity for me and my collaborators to retranslate many of also his canonical essays. So I'm very happy to answer to this question, because I think that, first of all, we really have to historically situate this critique, which of course made Tafuri very well known. As you know, it's a critique that is contained in his book, History and Theories and History of Architecture. Exactly, a book that really established Tafuri, at least in Italy. A book that was published in 1968 and really established him as a very important figure in architectural culture. He became professor in Venice exactly at that time, a few months after the publication of the book. And it's very important, first of all, to understand what Tafuri really means by operative criticism. He used exactly this critica operativa, operative criticism, not operative history, operative criticism. Now, why he's using this term while in fact he's discussing the work of what we now acknowledge as historians, Pevsner, Zevi, as you mentioned, to a certain extent also Benevolo is part of this critique. Because at that time, the discipline of history was in its infancy. History as we know it today as a very scholar kind of tradition. History of architecture, of course. And most of what we now call historians of architecture, like Gideon, like Zevi, were not just historians, they were often engaged in very contemporary polemics. For example, Zevi, beside writing his books, he was writing weekly on an Italian magazine, L'Espresso. He was really active in the contemporary field. And Tafuri often saw in this sort of the overlapping between the work of historical research and this more, let's say, journalistic kind of criticism a problem in which history was constantly driven by these contemporary concerns, and therefore history was constantly mystified in a way. And so basically his critique was exactly how history had to gain a certain independence from this urgency of the day, which of course in the case of Xavier and Gideon was also driven by a certain strategic support to the cause of, to the reformist cause of modern architecture. Tafuri actually was not against what we can call now operative history, because any history is operative. I mean, there is no way you can write a history that it doesn't have any operative purpose. No, even Tafuri's history is a very radically operative history. He simply, in fact, later he said, I shouldn't have used the term operative. I should have used the term prescriptive, because the kind of history that Xavier and Gideon were producing was a history that would prescribe to architects what kind of architecture to endorse or produce. So he was more against not the operativity of history, but more the use of history as a prescribing recipe, if you want. And I feel that this critique for me is still very important, because often when architects engage with history, they do it in a prescribing way. Like, I look to the work of a certain architect because, I want to design in that kind of direction. No? So there is always a sort of instrumentality that often is too direct. I mean, and in that sense, I think Tafuri's warning against this too easy instrumentality of architecture is a healthy reminder. Although, of course, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be interested in the work of other historical figures. But we have to be careful to, as I said before, to not put these figures outside of history, let's say, to not treat them as a sort of ahistorical figures, because I think this operation then produce a lot of mystifications, let's say.
So what I kind of got from your book was almost like a description of something like a sort of a teleological process in which, things move towards an ever-increasing abstraction. Same as I mentioned, like capitalism itself becoming ever more abstract, from gold standards to the bitcoins today, whatever. And also you talk about the data centers and the archism's no-stop city as becoming almost the reality of our present times. Somehow I was intrigued by the way in which you conclude your book by bringing this figure of Hannes Meyer into forefront. And I noted down here actually the very last sentence of your book, where you write, once the abstraction of architecture is unplugged from the logic of capitalist accumulation, it can become the most appropriate form of socialist life. And that's really the last sentence. And then we're there and we're just like wondering, like, okay, so you leave us with this sentence, but how after all this criticism of architecture and abstraction, like how can we indeed like articulate, let's say, an affirmative leftist proposition of what architecture and urban planning could be beyond capitalism? Obviously, when we talk about Hannes Meyer, we can think of Taige that I mentioned, and his debate with Le Corbusier, his emphasis on the fact that there should be first the revolution, but he also have this concept of, in Czech, it's called předobraz. And I often compare it to the notion of the wish image in Benjamin's writings, this kind of idea that architecture can serve as this sort of social condenser, that even though like the politics is still the same, but that in architecture we actually can experiment, as anticipate new forms of social organization. So I wonder, can you explain like what did you mean by this last sentence, and what's the affirmative proposition that we can build after all this critique?
Well, first of all, it's important to say is that a critique is not criticism. I mean, in a way, when you put something under critique, it's not that it's in order to throw it away. But critique for me is a way of sharpening our understanding of something, even at the cost of making it something that we would struggle with. But from the beginning of the book was never meant to be a rejection of abstraction. On the contrary, abstraction for me is a fundamental sine qua non of not only the production of architecture, but even of the way in which social organization works, especially when it comes to large societies. The question is how we can emancipate abstraction from the way in which abstraction became the harbor of, you know, what you mentioned before, of exchange value. I mean, how we can reclaim the use value of abstraction. And Hannes Meyer work for me is really about that. Hannes Meyer really, of course, in a way that didn't work through, but his curriculum at the Bauhaus for me is one of the most radical and courageous example to reclaim, in fact, the use value of abstraction. And for that reason, actually, his tenure as director of the Bauhaus didn't work, because actually all the many of the professors teaching at the Bauhaus, many of them actually abstract painters like Joseph Albers, for example, really wanted to still retain this more romantic and idealist interpretation of abstraction. They didn't want to actually see abstraction as really something that would comes from the organization of labor to the emergence of new building techniques. But also for Meyer, abstraction was also an attempt to socialize this condition and unplugged this condition from financial accumulation. And that's why the next step was to move to Soviet Russia. And actually, it's really a pity that his work in Soviet Russia is largely unknown. And it's interesting that when he left Soviet Russia, and he stayed there for a long time, and he also worked a lot as an architect, he's one of the few people who left Soviet Russia that never say anything negative of his experiences there. But actually, his work in that period remained not very well known, actually, to this day.
But I think that goes a little bit also with this kind of a negation of, you know, the architect as this master figure, because, like, just to give one example, you know, in Czechoslovakia, like after the communist revolution, the architecture itself, you know, obviously there were some figures like Karel Prager and so on, but much of that was organized within the Stavo project. Absolutely. You know, so yes. It was just like collectives, like architecture was, and it was to a certain extreme, obviously, you know, it didn't always bring only good results, but, you know, like architecture as like the design procedures, the project was turned into this kind of a radically collective enterprise of like groups organized within the state institutes.
Yes, it's interesting that Meyer teaching at the Bauhaus was very much focusing on this idea of the brigade. You know? So he wanted students to learn from their very education to collaborate, to find ways in which older students, instead of actually having this teacher-student relationship, in a way older students would actually teach to younger students, and professors would act more as a consultants, let's say. And for him, this organization of the curriculum was exactly a preparation to a way of producing architecture that was somehow collaborative, but not collaborative as a top-down kind of process, but really as a grassroots, I would say almost bottom-up process. And actually today there are certain experiences that rehearse or retrace this kind of way of working. For example, the collective Usina in Brazil, but also offices like La Colle in Barcelona, who are actually trying to, of course, within a much smaller scale, reclaim this sort of cooperative way of producing architecture. And I think that Meyer was really the precursor of this approach to architecture, where somehow, as you said, the figurehead of the architect is is recomposed within a role that is more of a technician's, let's say.
Well, maybe my last question, and then we turn it to the public, because I don't want to hold, I think this was quite intense, and I don't want to hold everyone for too long. I was wondering in your books, actually, how you choose well, basically you refer to many figures of Marxism, like, you mentioned, as in this Black Book, Mario Tronti and Raniero Panzieri. You talk about Walter Benjamin, about Jean Rethel, Henri Lefebvre. Could you maybe speak more about the kind of philosophical and theoretical references that are sort of outside of the field of architecture that you use? I think you quite successfully avoided all French structuralists and post-structuralists, which obviously played a big role into what Lacan would call the idéal linguisterie of the theoretical turn of the architecture discourse, let's say from 1960s to 1960s, that's 1980s, end of 1980s, that's the period I was working on. And perhaps we could say that the way in which those concepts were transferred into theoretical discourse on architecture was somehow parallel with also a certain depoliticization of the discourse, especially in the United States. So I wonder, could you talk more about your, let's say, theoretical references?
No, I don't think there is anything special. I mean, the only thing perhaps I can mention is that when I was a student, I belonged to a generation in Italy that somehow rediscovered certain authors, especially those that are today known as, Paraist tradition. Especially the work of Mario Tronti was very important for me, and but also authors very different from this milieu. One, I know this might sound controversial, especially now, but one thinker, I mean, he's not really a philosopher, actually he was a jurist, but a thinker that had also a lot of impact on my writings, on my view, not just of architecture, but of many things, is certainly Carl Schmitt. I think The Nomos of the Earth is a book that had huge impact on my work, and I know to mention now him is very controversial, but one has to confront his demons, and certainly his work has been very important. Actually, it was I was introduced to Schmitt through Tronti. Actually, Mario was a very important, very strong reader of his writings, and something that he always told me, like, we should use also the enemy, let's say. We should also use this way of thinking that liberal left is always trying to reject, because they have, thinking. I mean, thinking sometimes is an instrument, is a device, and we shouldn't care too much where it comes from. Let's say we should also use it for our own interest and purposes. Going back to French theory, it's true. There was nothing really. I didn't did it on purpose, but I have to say I really enjoy, and although I don't think I've ever used them in any of my writings, but something I really enjoy were Roland Barthes' writings on Bertolt Brecht. I found those. I think he wrote like 2 or 3 essays. He was a big fan of Brecht. And I think he wrote the most beautiful, really, analysis of his theater. And actually, going back to Hannes Meyer, I always thought Hannes Meyer being like the Bertolt Brecht of architecture. So there is maybe I will write something using Barthes' writings on Brecht.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you both very much. I wanted to ask a question because of your interest in art and abstraction, because I was working recently on Kandinsky because of his interest in improvisation. And actually, I found that you actually confront this in an early article of yours. I think it's one of those, Who's Afraid of the Foreign Object? Yeah. So And we see also improvisation as a factor in urban planning. And since I don't know very much about architecture, I always thought they were very separate. But then you sort of put them together, so I feel better about that now. People like Walter Hood in the US and so on. So what I wanted to ask you was really, how do improvisation and abstraction relate, let's say, since Kandinsky, and in architecture, not in art?
Yes, actually, it's an interesting question because within the history of abstraction, there is both the embrace of abstraction really as a sort of process of reification of the experience of the modern condition. And I think that I'm more close to this approach to abstraction, but also within abstraction, as you know, there is also an attempt to reclaim the human subject, the human subjectivity. So there is a kind of post-human and humanist abstraction. And in fact, it's interesting you mentioned Kandinsky, because as you know, Kandinsky happened to be in the very early days of Soviet Russia, and he actually also had a position actually in one of the institutes that were responsible for reorganizing the arts. And actually, he got attacked by people like Alexander Gans, or the figure that would then become the theorist of constructivism, because they identify Kandinsky as more of a romantic interpretation of abstraction. So they rejected this kind of, as you call it, improvising approach to abstraction, and they looked to abstraction really as a process of reification or transformation of the artist into a technician, something that in fact artists like Kandinsky, but also Klee and later Halbers rejected. Especially that was the main struggle at the Bauhaus. It was exactly between, on one hand, Hannes Meyer, who really wanted to almost get rid of arts from the curriculum of the school, and then this more arts and craft or romantic tradition of art or as an introduction to then building and architecture that was established by Gropius by inviting in fact all these artists. It's an interesting debate. I also like all these artists. I'm not it's difficult to take side. It's a very interesting discussion. I have to say that being myself also so interested in painting, this kind of struggle within abstraction has been a very interesting topic. I mean, I would like to maybe in the future really explore more about these issues. Yeah, but in a way, in the book, I took the side more of this constructivist, if you want, approach to abstraction. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for this conference, and it's very interesting. I would like to know how it's possible to use abstraction in rehabilitation, as it is possible that we will do most tomorrow. And in your book, Less is Enough, you speak about asceticism, and for you, how it's possible to link asceticism and abstraction. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Actually, I have to say something very important. I mean, not that I consider my work so important, but since we are discussing this book, usually I don't think my books or all my writings are chapters of one theory. So there is between them sometimes a kind of disconnection. So I wouldn't know what would be the link between asceticism and abstraction, because for me these are very different topics, and maybe there is some link, I don't know, but there is nothing intentional in writing this on this topic. I'm not trying to build like a grand theory where every book or every writing is really a chapter of something coherent. And also, I don't think there is abstraction is not something we use. I mean, abstraction is really a condition in which we dwell. It's really both a an existential condition, but also the objective conditions in which our society reproduces itself. But there are ways in which, through architecture, through art, we can manifest it in ways that it's not mystifying this condition. That's why I like architects like Hannes Meyer, but also artists like Mondrian, because in their work, for me, there is a possibility of a non-mystifying representation of abstraction. So when I look to a Mondrian painting, for me, it's almost a fragment of a condition that, of course, is very much sublimated, but it's not so distant from the way in which really our life is concretely organized. So I really believe that the power of art and architecture is to create these moments of clarity, these moments of Aufklärung, let's say, and that's maybe the only way in which we can, emancipate ourselves, both as architects but also as users of space.
Thank you for the conference. There, you just showed a picture of the San Lorenzo in Florence. That's very interesting. But for you, it's a very abstraction because it's a control of the labor force and also how to construct the idea of architecture for Brunelleschi. But for me, it's a much more economic. How to say that? More figurative way to inspire me, because it makes me think about the painting of Masaccio, the Trinity of Masaccio in a church of Florence, maybe Santa Maria, I don't know the name. For me, it's more like a reference, it's a figurative reference, but for you, it's just very, abstract.
Well, yes, I think you are absolutely right. I mean, I offer one interpretation of Brunelleschi's work, and as you know, Brunelleschi is an architect on which many authors and writers have written, and actually there is certainly in Brunelleschi also still a sort of Gothic actually sensibility, for example, in the way in which he used ornament. I mean, Brunelleschi's work, there is a very sensitive, very precise use of ornament. But I wanted to emphasize really the fact that his architecture is abstract in the sense that is one of the very first attempt to build architecture as a syntactic form, as a form that really has a language that was very much at odds with the customs of building at the time. For example, the large use of pietra serena, this gray stone, which Brunelleschi really used in a extremely strategic way to emphasize not just the load-bearing structure, but really the lineaments of his buildings. And first of all, this pietra serena is really gray, is gray almost as a Gerhard Richter gray paintings. I mean, it's almost like countering the very richly ornamented features through which actually master builders often were expressing their agency on buildings. But also this very sharp contrast between this gray stone and the whitewash walls. This is very unique of Brunelleschi. I mean, it's almost as if he wants to make this syntactic form of his buildings very visible. In fact, in a way that it counters any possibility of improvising or ad hoc way of building from the builders. So that is actually what I wanted to emphasize. But of course, if you look to his projects, seldom this kind of process of abstraction failed. There are a lot of moments in which this disegno actually enter into a crisis, of course, because Brunelleschi was constantly then confronting the nature, the way in which building sites were organized, where in fact builders still had a certain agency to eventually change some of his projects. So in a way, you're absolutely right, there is still a a certain figurative sensibility in his work, but I think this sharp contrast of gray and white is for me very revelatory of a completely new way of producing architecture, which was absolutely unprecedented even in Florence itself.
Thank you for your answer. It's a very, it's very inspirative. And which one do you think is more important in architecture? How to say that iconographic reference, or the abstract reference, or abstract thinking in architecture? Because in art history we have Abi Wahbuk, just like a historian of art, and also a lot of offices. In our time, use a lot of images as like British offices or some offices in Paris. Maybe you are right. You have this constructural way to think about architecture, which is the most different between two of them.
Between what? Sorry.
Between the iconographic way to think about architecture or the abstract way to think about architecture.
I mean, in a way, you could say that on one hand, abstraction has always been latent in the way architecture is produced, because the moment we produce through design, through plans, through measure, somehow even the most figurative kind of architecture has always the product of an abstraction, no? So even when we look to a Greek temple, which certainly is not an abstract form, it was a form full of symbolic features, its way of production being, so much rely on geometric thinking, on proportions, on mathematical know-how or geometrical know-how, even that figurative architecture has a core that is very abstract. Of course, what happened with modernity, especially in the 20th century, is that architects really try to reveal this hidden abstraction, no? In a way, by emphasizing construction, by emphasizing the process of production, no? And I'm really interested in that moment. I'm really interested in this sort of moment in which this non-symbolic, non-figurative understanding of architecture is revealed. I think many of the architects I look at are really these sort of revelations of these moments of abstraction. And I have to say that I'm an architect after all, and towards these architects I have a mix of there is a critique, of course, but there is also an admiration that I cannot really detach myself from. So I think there is a certain ambiguity, I would say, especially in this book, that this suspension between critique but also admiration for this, for the work of these architects. Yeah.
Should we take maybe and we'll be here, so I think there's some drinks coming, so you can just feel free to come by and talk informally. Have a look at the books. You can purchase the Architecture and Abstraction from the Red Wheelbarrow, and you can also have a look at our Suture Press books. There's a lot of energy and time that went into those books, so please stop by Meredith over there and have a look at them.
And keep in mind that I already lectured for 4 hours this morning, so it's like today I have 6 hours non-stop lecturing, so be kind.